Hi, welcome to session one of the eighth topic of the semester, Texas during crises and reforms from 1890 to 1939. So in this session, we're actually starting a whole new topic. We're moving forward in the timeline in Texas history, and we're going to look at a period in Texas history in which there's going to be a series of crises that affected people's ability to either participate in the political process or succeed in the economic system, in the new economic system that emerged after Reconstruction. We were talking about actually in the previous topic about the rise of this industrial, commercial, capitalist economy in Texas. Texas is modernizing. We were looking at this process of modernization in Texas with the transformation of different sectors of the economy, such as the agricultural sector. It was commercialized. Now farmers are moving into the market. They're trying to modernize their farms, produce cash crops to make money. And this is, again, something that thousands upon thousands of farmers in Texas are actually doing after Reconstruction. They're trying to move into the market. That is to say, there's a market and there's now a national market. We were talking about that in the previous topic. The producers in Texas are going to now find markets all over the country because there's transportation systems like railroads, etc., that allow for producers in Texas to ship out their products and so on. So again, we saw also the rise of many kinds of industries, shops, manufacturers, industries of various kinds. We were looking at that very closely. And of course, with the rise of an industrial revolution taking place in Texas, we also see, for example, the rise of the industrial working class. So there's now, again, industrial workers in Texas also that are now moving into this wage labor system, this wage labor economy, in which they're now working for the new industries. We discussed, quite in depth, all of the industries that flourished in Texas in this transition towards modernity. And of course, we're going to see that people are moving into those industrial centers, whether it's in Houston, for example, in Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and the like, again, where the industries were located, including the oil industry, by the way. And that gave, again, rise to the industrial working class. So what we're going to see is that in Texas, particularly, there's going to be, of course, people trying to succeed in this new economy, in this new society, this new modern society that was flourishing quite fast in Texas. And we're going to see, particularly in this topic, how the peoples of Texas experience moments of crisis, meaning that not everybody was really succeeding, for example. Not, for example, farmers, not all 100%, all the farmers were actually succeeding in this new market economy. The working class had their own problems. And we're going to actually examine, for example, what kind of problems farmers and workers actually had, as well as the middle class, by the way. And we're going to pay attention how they attempted to address some of those problems. Again, this is a topic that is called Texas during crisis and reforms, and we're going to be paying attention to three main different crises and reforms that Texas went through in this transition towards modernity, as people were trying to adapt, to this new economy, to this new society, this modern society. Again, they were experiencing a lot of difficulties, obstacles in which their lives, their economic well-being, for example, again, was thrown into a crisis. And they're trying to address those crises through reforms. Again, so now let's look at our outline here so we can actually see now the title of our, this is the 8th topic of the semester. There will be 3 sessions as well, just like the other ones. in a very similar fashion. Okay. So again, Texas during crisis and reforms from 1890 to 1939. And once again, this is something that modern society that are modernizing, this is a very clear case study again of how societies that are modernizing, such as Texas, um, do so, but not without any difficulties or problems or obstacles. This transition from an agricultural, rural society in which people are simply subsisting from the land, growing their own crops, or pretty much owning land to graze cattle, etc. The kind of the simple family-owned type of enterprises of the past, as those types of small scale enterprises, those family owned enterprises that are based on subsistence, as they begin to disappear and people are now moving towards a more capitalist economy, working for wages or growing crops for the market and so on, moving to cities, that transition is not an easy one. Okay. Is often met with, sometimes with problems of dislocation, confusion. People are disoriented as to what is this new society like? Am I going to actually survive, succeed? For example, living in a city with strangers, for example, whereas back in my farming community, I knew everybody, for example, problems like that. Are they going to actually enjoy the benefits of this new economy, higher standards of living? Are they going to earn good wages, for example, etc.? So all of those questions, again, are all of those problems, all of those difficulties are actually faced by virtually every society that transitions from a subsistence type of economy based on farming or cattle ranching into now a more commercial agriculture and industrial production. There is, a crisis, a period of crisis, in other words, that again, we're going to actually analyze Texas here very closely, and how the people of Texas try to address those crises is precisely through reforms. In other words, that it was essential to solve the crises that the peoples that we're going to actually analyze in this topic were actually experiencing. And the solution to many of those problems, people felt, centered on reforming the institutions, reforming the economy, reforming industry, for example, introducing legislation, laws that will change the way the economy was administered, for example. So it's exactly how, again, we're going to actually, address this topic. We're going to look at, in the table of contents, particularly, we're going to look at 3 moments of crises that led to specific reform movements that was representative of that period of time in which people were trying to really solve the problems in their societies. Of course, we're actually talking about Texas, so we're going to just exclusively pay attention to Texas here. So in this first session, we're going to look at the period of the 1880s, 1890s, particularly 1890s, again, in which we're going to see farmers and workers in Texas creating their own associations, their own mutual aid type of communities, if you will. They're going to come together for mutual support, mutual aid, because it was better for them to actually come together and help each other. Okay, and they're becoming highly organized and politicized as well. And eventually they're going to create a third political party called the Populist Party. Okay, populism. This is, again, the popular reform movement that we see in Texas, populism, which, by the way, it was also a national movement. Again, it's not just a state level type of movement or state centered, but it was actually a national movement that found its very unique expression in Texas, the populism. This is, again, we're going to be looking at, in this particular session. And then in the second session, after this, we're going to look at, in part 2, We're going to look at the period, roughly speaking, from 1900 to 1920. It was called the Progressive Era. Again, this is another reform movement in which now the participants of this movement in Texas was a great many of them, the advocates of, we call the progressives, in other words, that wanted to bring about reform in the political system, in the economic system in Texas, but in the country as a whole as well. A great many were members of the middle class. So the progressive reform movement, again, was really a middle class movement, whereas in the populist, of the 1890s was actually a movement of farmers and workers. Okay, so it is now in part two, we're going to look at the middle class, particularly the middle class, who are going to become the progressives. And we're going to look at exactly what they were attempting to accomplish. In other words, what the middle class was going through during the 1910s and 20s that was affecting the middle class, particularly that they believed it was essential, again, to reform the economic and political system of Texas. Again, we're going to look at that as well. Okay, so in part three, at the very end, we're going to look at the Great Depression. Texas is another moment of crisis, another moment in which Texas experienced an economic crisis, but it was an economic crisis that really affected the world as a whole. It was not just Texas, it was also the United States, and it was really the rest of the world. In the 1930s, again, the rest of the world was going through an economic crisis, the crisis of capitalism. Capitalism comes crashing in 1929, and capitalism actually comes to a halt for an entire decade from 1929 to 1939. And we're going to see the Great Depression. This is another crisis again that affected the state of Texas. And we're going to look at how in Texas there will be efforts to deal with the Depression. Okay, what kind of legislation, what kind of reforms were introduced for the state of Texas that attempted to provide relief to the population, to provide also to help the economy recover and reform as well the economic system. Again, so this is another, in Texas in the Great Depression, another moment of crisis and reform. Those are three moments of crisis and reforms that we're going to actually look at very closely, again, in this topic. Now, after the introduction let's just go through, the a more in-depth, if you will, introduction to this topic. I provided a very quick overview again, just a few minutes ago about what the topic was going to be about, of course. But I would like to offer a more in-depth analysis again of this topic and why it's important. In other words, to put this topic in a larger picture. In other words, so we can actually see, for example, from afar, for example, this era that we're talking about from 1890 to 1939. So this is going to be a very quick, but also very useful general introduction to the topic. So once again, during this period of time, when we're talking about, from 1890 to 1939, this is an era that in world history, okay, is referred as the era of the crisis of modernity, okay? Because the modern era begins, again, back in the 1700s with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, something we already discussed in previous topics, okay? The rise of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of democracy, for example, natural rights, representative form of governments, the rise of capitalism, as well, back in the 1700s, the modern world flourished, starting around the 1700s, again, with this high-tech industrial civilization is on the rise. Again, with democratic systems of government, etc. So it's a new civilization altogether. It is true. So that civilization has been on the rise since the 1700s, spreading into parts of Europe, Western Europe, particularly North America, United States, and Texas, of course, was now part of this, of course, transition, particularly and more specifically after the Civil War. It is really after the Civil War that Texas begins this process of modernization, if you will. And we discussed already quite fully, in the previous topic, again, all of the industries, all of the economic changes that Texas was going through, even the social changes. We're going to see the rise of big cities. People are moving now to the big cities. They're living in a new social setting. So, yes, so this is happening, but at the end of the 19th century, the late 19th century, in the beginning stages, the first, let's say, 3 decades of the 20th century, the societies that were already in this path towards modernity, such as the United States, of course, Texas, and the Western European countries, entered into a period of crisis, so to speak, particularly because of this process of the era of the past, the agricultural civilization of the past, was actually rapidly dwindling. It was disintegrating in such a fast rate, such a fast speed, that now we're going to see, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, we're going to see a whole new society, okay? A whole new way of life, a whole new way of doing work. In that not everybody was able to actually adapt. Okay, the idea is, look, if we modernize, there's going to be increasing opportunities for people to actually live better, to have more money. So we're going to have now technologies producing everything that we require. Every product, everything that society needs is going to be produced by technology, by industries. And this is going to be like a paradise, this earthly paradise that this high-tech industrial civilization actually promised. It's true. But as people transition into this new civilization, okay, with now a new way of doing work inside of factories, for example, working inside of buildings, surrounded by machinery, etc., and earning wages, for example. They're going to now become urban dwellers, city dwellers. They're going to live with tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of people, many of whom they don't really know. So that transition towards this new mode of life, this new mode of doing work, this new society, okay, it was really, for many people, again, very, very dramatic. Okay, the change was so drastic. The traditions of the past were coming to an end, and something new was being born. But this new society, this new economic system, seemed very strange for a lot of people. So because of that, again, we're going to see that when people enter into a period of crisis because of difficulties adapting, again, to a new society or a new economy, for example, or because, economically speaking, they just feel that they cannot really truly succeed. In other words, that the possibility for success, even though they work, they discipline themselves, they strive towards success, that they just can't accomplish it. In other words, that there are a number of factors outside of themselves that prevent them from actually achieving that goal of attaining, economic success. So for that reason, again, we're going to see that the way that those modern societies try to address all of those problems, whether they were economic problems or social problems, etc., again, in this transition towards modernity, is through reform. So this period of time from 1890 to 1939 was also referred as the Age of Reform. The Age of Reform in American history, also in Texas history. This is, again, an age in which what was really in the minds of most people, okay, living in the United States, whether there is living in Texas or any other state, by the way, because now Texas is part of the U.S., by the way. But even if we just want to isolate Texas from the rest of the country, even if we just want to just see Texas alone, what was really in the minds of the peoples of Texas is reform. That it is through reform that we can actually fix all of the problems. We can fix all of the obstacles that prevent people from either adapting to this new society or achieving economic success, in other words. So everything that prevents people from actually attaining a higher standard of living, or adapting to the city life, or working in industries that provided good paying jobs, etc., safety measures, etc., that all of that could just simply be fixed through reform. So we're going to see intense activism. People are becoming highly organized during this period of time, and there's going to be three reform movements that will be dominant in different moments of Texas history, which really correspond as well to U.S. history as well. Okay, it really, Texas was part of this larger whole. So what was really going on in Texas was also part of this larger national scene as well. So the populism, for example, was the first one we're going to see, in particular in this part. Populism is the first popular reform movement of the 1880s, 1890s, followed by the progressive or progressivism of the 1910s and 1920s. We're going to see that very closely, another reform movement, and of course the New Deal movement as well of the 1930s that tried to solve the problem of the Great Depression as well. Okay, so it's very important that those are reform movements, whether it's the populist or progressive or the New Deal. The common denominator, despite the fact that they were very different from one another, there are some commonalities running through those movements as well, but the common denominator, what that unites all of them together, is really the idea of reform. That the proponents, the advocates of those movements really wanted to bring about change through legislation, once again, introducing legislation at the state level, at the local level, but also at the national level in a way that it will fix, in other words, the problems that farmers or workers or the middle class or society as a whole faced, that prevented people from actually achieving this ideal existence. Because people had this idea that we were striving to create this ideal, society. In other words, this modernity, the promise of modernity is, achieving this ideal existence, for people to actually live happy, have jobs, have incomes, and enjoy themselves through consumption as well. So a lot of people couldn't enjoy that during this period of time. That's why they became highly organized and they created their own political movements. Okay, again, so this is again a very more direct, more cohesive, explanation of the ideas that are going to be running through, this topic. In other words, it's reform, it's crises, of course, looking at crises, but also looking at reforms as well in Texas. Okay, all right. So now let's look at part one. And in part one, we're going to look at populism, the populist reform movement, and which I already mentioned. This is a movement that spanned, roughly speaking, from the 1880s to the 1890s. Although there are no clear dates when the movement begins and when it ends, we can just see that in particular the decades between the 1880s and 90s, the populists were already, again, much on the rise in Texas and in the national scene as well. But as I mentioned, the populist movement was actually conformed by two specific social groups in Texas, and those were the farmers and the workers. Farmers and workers constituted really the backbone of the populist movement in Texas. Okay, they were known as the populists, in other words, farmers and workers. And so let us look at some of the problems, some of the issues that farmers and workers were facing prior to them coming together to form this political movement, so we can understand what was really going on, in their lives, what problems they faced, what obstacles, they confronted, in order to really understand why they're going to come together, become politicized, highly organized, and finally enter the world of politics and pretty much launch a reform movement that wanted to bring about political and economic change in the state, okay, to address the problems of the farmers and the workers, okay? So let's look first and foremost at farmers, okay? We're going to start with farmers here, not because they are more important than workers. We're not really here trying to determine which of those groups are more important. But this is a group that was perhaps the oldest, okay, in the state. Farmers really go back, in Texas, farming is perhaps one of the oldest economic activity, going back to the Spanish colonists again. So again, this is a very, very ancestral, if you will, tradition, okay? Farming. And we mentioned already, again, in the previous topic, how and why farmers in Texas transition into commercial farming, commercial agriculture. We already looked at that. We're not going to repeat ourselves. But it's important to explain, what was the experience of farmers leading that simple family-owned, if you will, type of enterprise in which people were simply growing crops to sustain themselves, now to transform that enterprise into a commercial enterprise in which people are trying to make money now from the land. They're going into business, in other words. They're going to become commercial farmers. What was their experience like? Did they attain success as they attempted to transition now into this market economy? That will explain what was really going on with farmers, that will enable us to understand, how, they're going to come together and trying to actually introduce certain reforms. We will understand, the kind of bills or legislation that they wanted to implement. All right. So at any rate, so let's look at farmers here. Okay. The factors affecting farmers in Texas. Now, this is something that is pretty much universal. You can actually see that happening in even across the United States. Farmers in the United States are in the same predicament. They're attempting to modernize. They're attempting to go into business by transforming their technologies. They're trying to acquire new tools, machinery that will enable them to actually mass produce crops. This is like trying to introduce technology in the farm so you can have like a factory, in other words, mass production. You really want, to maximize output, grow as much as possible, extract as much products out of the land, in other words, with the new technologies. So that's exactly, again, some of the issues that farmers in Texas are actually going through, is that they must get a hold of the new technology. It's really things like tractors, irrigation systems, fertilizers, barbed wire, you name it. Okay. So all of that must be purchased. And is very expensive. Again, it's expensive as it is today. Okay. So, I mean, if you're trying to buy a tractor, if you're a farmer, you'll realize that it's very expensive. The alternative, if you don't have the cash, because most farmers just don't have the cash at hand to buy that technology, the alternative back in this day is commercial loans, commercial banking. So you go to a bank or a financial institution and you're trying to actually obtain a loan so you could actually buy that equipment. That is actually a must. You cannot go into business if you're a farmer by using traditional, techniques, the traditional techniques of the past, in which you just work with your family, for example, and you bring a horse and you're trying to simply plow the land with a mule, etc., that will be enough for you as a family, in other words, as a family enterprise, but not as a business. So you need technology. It's a must. So you need to go to a bank. The bank will loan you the money, but banks often actually, even today, of course, require security, a guarantee, because if they're actually extending a loan to you, they must make sure that you're going to repay it, because that will be an insecure loan, in other words. So the way banks operated back then is that when farmers didn't have monies, they have to actually go to a bank, and the bank will request something again as a form of security, what's called collateral. In other words, collateral. So the only asset, the only the only value that the farmer had was his farm. Okay, I only have my farm. This is the only thing that is valuable that can actually secure the loan. So if I default on the loan, well, the bank can simply seize the farm, in other words. And the bank actually is going to guarantee that the bank is not going to lose the investment. In other words, yeah, we're going to, loan you the money, and the expectation is that you're going to pay it off in 5-10 years, etc. You're growing food, so there's always going to be food around, so you're always going to be making money. It seems like a very sure type of investment. But if for some reason that farmer is unable to make payments, well, the bank is going to seize the farm, of course. So again, what is going to happen in Texas is that a great number of farmers are going to place their farms on a mortgage. That is to say that they borrow money by placing their farm as collateral, and so they're trying to pay off that loan in order to really get their farm back, fully, because at that point, the bank is simply holding that property as a form of security. It's not the bank's property. But if the farmer, again, is unable to pay the loan back, the farmer will inevitably lose the farm. In other words, again, it's placed on collateral. So this is something that a great number of farmers are doing. And this is a must. Once again, this is not something that they question. You have to, upgrade your technology. You have to get the latest tractors, sprinklers, irrigation systems, water pumps. If you have access to electricity, by the way, you will have to get that, again, to stay in business. So first and foremost, this is something that is going to become a problem, as we'll see, because not all farmers were able to pay back their loans. We're going to get there eventually again. But first and foremost, expensive machinery. The machinery is so expensive that they needed to actually borrow money and actually place their farms as collateral. Okay, that's number one. The second problem is that not all farmers obtain credit. Okay, not all farmers were able to obtain those loans because back during this time that we're talking about, the dollar was still based on the gold standard. Again, it was the gold, again, that was sustaining the dollar. So because gold was limited in supply, it was scarce. Also, the dollar as well was constricted. It was restricted to only the amount of gold that the country had. So therefore, banks couldn't just issue all the loans that they wanted. Okay, there was a limitation to that. There was only certain amount of credit available. It's limited credit because there was limited gold, because of the gold standard. Okay, so this is important, that not all farmers were able to modernize because of the gold standard. Okay, this is another thing, again, that prevented farmers from actually modernizing their farms, upgrading their farms. Okay, in this case, the gold standard. Now, number three is that the farmers, in many cases, as I mentioned, again, in point number one, were unable to actually pay back their loans, the loans they obtained to buy the technology, because there were moments, okay, in the natural cycle, if you will, of the economy, that they were unable to produce crops because there was a series of droughts that affected the countryside. And this is, again, was actually a national problem, by the way. It was not just a Texas problem, but there was also other states that experienced similar situations again. For example, some of the issues that farmers realized, by obtaining, for example, the new technologies. Okay, well, you got all these technologies. You got, for example, you got tractors, you got, you got fertilizers, etc. You got all those that innovation. What they realize is that now that more and more farmers are obtaining, okay, all of those technologies, they realize that now that they have new tools, more sophisticated, by the way, and they're now mass producing, that mass production in itself was going to affect the price of the products that they're actually creating. Okay, so again, so what happens is that with technology, now that you bring in new technology, you have, of course, the incredible ability to accelerate the rate of production because you have machinery at your disposal. So that's a great advantage of this new era of technology, that you can actually produce vast quantities of different products, in this case, food products, because now you have machines doing the work much faster and easier than ever. But that the negative side of that, the downturn, the downside here is that with so much supply of grain, there's so much food being produced. Now, because there's only so much food people can eat, by the way, there's only so much corn or wheat or vegetables or fruits that people can consume. What's going to happen is that with this new technology, we're going to see, of course, the problem of overproduction. They're just, farmers are just concerned with producing excessive amounts of products out of the land and trying to sell it on the market, whether it's within Texas or outside. That's all they're thinking about. They want to make money. They're really in a frenzy, going crazy with this new technology, that all they think about, again, is simply produce as much as possible. But the downside is if you flood the market with so much grain, with so much food, what's going to happen is that at some point, the supply is going to exceed the demand. And when that happens, you have falling prices. The prices of products like, for example, wheat and corn, citruses, vegetables, and cotton, etc. All of that is going to start falling very, very rapidly because it's mass production. Okay, and there's thousands of farmers actually engaged in this type of mass production type of economy. And so what's going to happen is that with falling prices, farmers realize that they were not really making money. In other words, I'm not really making money because the price is falling very rapidly. So I expected, that I was actually going to be making more money every year because I was going to be able to produce more and more every year. But as more and more people produce vast quantities of products every year, the prices kept falling and falling every year. So many of them were unable to keep up with the payments, with the loans they obtained, going the commercial loans. And as people are falling behind those balance of payments and they're going to default, as soon as they default, what happens is that the financial institution, the bank, is going to come in and, of course, seize the farm, because the farm was actually the security, the guarantee of the loan. And as farmers are unable to pay those loans back, because the interests were also quite elevated as well, now they found themselves that the financial institution comes in, seizes the property. But what happened here, again, in Texas, as well as in other places of the United States, is that in many cases, farmers were not really evicted from their property. Okay, it's not like the financial institution came in and evicted the farmer. Okay, but rather, what the financial institution is going to do is actually put that farm on the market, sell it to an individual, like an investor, etc., like a merchant. And that individual simply is going to allow the new owner, again, the new owner of the farm is going to allow the farmer to stay in the property, to stay in the farm. But now farmers have to pay rent just to stay in the farm. In other words, you can continue living in the farm, you can continue working the land, but now you have to pay rent. Okay, this is what is called tenant farming, tenant farmers. Farmers that are paying rents on farms that they previously owned, but they lost, again, to a bank. Okay, it's called tenant farmers. And the situation got to a point that by the turn of the century, about 50% of farmers in Texas were now tenant farmers. Okay, so this is one of the obstacles, again, is that not everybody was experiencing success. They were trying to succeed, the farmers, by acquiring the technologies. They borrowed the money to get it. But because they're overproducing, the prices are going to fall very sharply, very dramatically. And this is, again, leading to many of them losing their farms, their properties, and they're being not really evicted, but they're allowed to actually stay there. And now they're just paying rent to a landlord. Okay. The farm is now owned by a landlord. You know, this another person actually owns the property, but the farmer is still trying to stay in business, trying to still grow products for the market, but at the same time, make payments every month. There's a rent to pay, in other words. Okay. So this is what farmers actually going through. And another problem that farmers in Texas are going to go through, of course, is high railroad rates as well. Okay, so transporting your product to the city, for example, from the farm to the city was very costly. So the rates, railroads actually charge very elevated rates, to the point that on an average, the cost that took for a farmer to ship all the product to the city was about the 20% of the net worth of the entire harvest, in other words. So let us just say that you harvested 100 tons of grain, in your farm, 100 tons. Well, you will need to actually sell 20 tons of those 100 just to pay, for transporting the grain to the city. Okay, because of the high, high rates. So that's another problem, is that, they're trying to make money, but transportation was very costly because of the railroads, of course. That's another issue. Of course, the middleman, middlemen, of course, this is something that farmers are very unhappy about, is that in many cases, it was easier to sell your product to a middleman, okay, other than you going directly to the city in order to actually sell it in a city, for example. It's too much of a hassle, in other words, for a farmer to leave the farm for a few weeks, go to a city and sell the product to the highest bidder. In other words, for example, to a grocery store or a food industry of some kind, like a cereal industry, etc., or a can industry. It was just too much of a hassle to do that. So what actually happened is that in many cases there will be a middleman knocking on your door saying, look, come here, I'll buy all your products all at once, all of it. Of course, you have to pay for transportation. There's a cost there you have to pay. So the farmer has to pay for transportation. But what the middleman is doing is pretty much buying everything wholesale. But the problem is that since the middleman is trying to make money, the middleman is going to take care, again, of actually dealing with all of the stores or industries, the food industries in the city. He's going to be the one actually selling the product in the city somewhere, somehow. That's his business. But he's trying to make money. so he's going to buy at very low prices. In other words, farmers were actually underselling, in many cases, their product because there was a middleman. The middleman was buying low, and he turned around, go to the city, and was selling at a high price. In other words, so he was actually, also getting a large cut of the profits of the farmers. In other words, of that product as well, not just transportation costs that were taking a toll, a burden on the farmers, but also the middleman as well. And also, another issue, of course, is the issue of natural calamities as well. Okay, another issue that farmers face in Texas is, again, nature. I just mentioned, for example, that a few moments ago, that farmers were also affected by the natural cycles, for example. Even though they're acquiring technologies and they're able to produce, products with the new machinery, well, not all farmers in Texas, for example, have access to irrigation systems because of electricity. Electricity arrives, but it's only arriving to the large cities, such as Dallas and Houston, for example, large urban centers. Whereas in the countryside, electricity is not really arriving at the same rate, at the same speed, that the big cities in Texas actually, of course, enjoy now this service. So therefore, a great portion of farmers in Texas are still relying on rain, on the cycles of nature, that is to say, that they're tying their rhythms, their economy, their economy in the farm to the rhythms, the cycles of nature. So if there's going to be a rain cycle, that is great. Okay, there's years that are very productive. There's plenty of rain. And there's other years, again, part of the natural cycles is that there's some years that bring drought. Nature goes through those cycles of rains and droughts, warm and cold, and so on. Year after year, they vary. Those are the rhythms. Those are the cycles of nature. And so there were also, again, farmers affected by those, particularly the drought cycles. And there was one that was very severe in the years of 1885, 1886 that affected Texas very heavily. Again, Texas was affected in a very significant way by those droughts, and that actually limited the ability of farmers in Texas to stay in business. Many of them fell behind on balance of payments because of loans they obtained, for example. And in many cases, they did not receive any assistance, again, from the state, because they had to stop producing for at least 2 years or 3 years. So there will be no money coming in other words, for at least 3 years during those drought cycles, in other words. Another calamities, again, those are natural calamities of nature that affect the farmers as well. And blizzards. In many cases, again, there were blizzards that will come in, tornadoes, for example, or blizzards that will destroy entire crops. And that also, again, proved to be a challenge, a difficulty for farmers to stay in business as well, losing their entire crop. Again, they'll have to wait until the next year to see if they're going to have some luck and success to stay in business. Okay, so again, farmers had difficulties transitioning into this modern economy. The transition was not easy. There were so many challenges, in other words. So for that reason, we're going to see now the rise of this agrarian movement in Texas. Agrarian means farmers, an agricultural movement, in other words. The movement of farmers coming together, and they're going to start now forming associations of various kinds in order to provide support, mutual aid, in order to help each other actually deal with those challenges, to help each other, in other words. So it all started in 1867, okay? In 1867, as early as 1867, by the way, I mean, this is really at the end of the Civil War. It was really just after the Civil War when we're going to see the very first farmers in Texas coming together to create their own independent farmers organization called the Grange. Okay, the Grange. It was formed by Oliver Keeley, again, in Texas. It was otherwise known as the Patrons of Husbandry. Okay, it went again also by two names. Some people call it the Patrons of Husbandry, others the Grange. Okay, it's interchangeable. Those are terms that back during this time people knew that those were actually farmers associations that were like local chapters, if you will. They were, farmers that belong to, let's say, the same community. They will actually come together for mutual support. So instead of working independently and seeing themselves as simply as individuals, trying to succeed by their own effort, independent of the help or the efforts of others, instead of that, they're now going to start forming groups, in other words, because this is part of human nature, by the way, is that people feel more secure when they're in a group, when you see support from others. It is easier to feel that you can succeed and overcome problems when you come together with other people that are experiencing the same thing as you do. So you share similar experiences of the world. You share the same similar challenges. So you understand each other. You speak the same language, in other words. So you can actually come together and deal again with problems that affect all the members equally, that is to say. So that's exactly what the Grange represented again. It was really, again, an association of farmers coming together from the same community so they can actually work as groups now, to work as groups. And the idea was that they were trying to foster the advancement of the group in a social and educational level. That is to say, look, we need to advance as a group, as a society. Okay, we need to succeed, be able to educate ourselves, to acquire the skills, the knowledge of how to farm better or acquire certain techniques, certain knowledge, certain technologies that will help all of us. So instead of, again, separating yourself from others, that they were actually trying to integrate themselves into a larger community, in other words, creating like a group identity, a group consciousness, if you will, are farmers that are going to actually share ideas. They're going to educate each other. They're going to hold meetings and trying to be updated every year with the latest developments in science and technology regarding farming, etc. That was the idea, to be high tech, in other words. Look, we need to really be at the very forefront of farming technology, farming education. We need to help each other as well. So those types of organizations called the Grange are going to be replicated in other parts of many parts of Texas, and eventually they're going to be replicated all over the country. Okay, all over the United States. It emerges in a very organic way in Texas called the Grange, and this kind of organization, this mutual aid organization, is going to be copied, okay, elsewhere. Farmers are coming together in different localities and creating their own local chapters, so to speak. Okay, so in that community, in that region, farmers are coming together to help each other, of course. And one way they were trying to help each other, besides, of course, trying to educate one another, etc., it was by forming what is called an economic cooperative. Okay, this is very important. An economic cooperative. So you might ask, so what is an economic cooperative? Okay, in this case, what is an economic cooperative? That the farm was not going to be owned by an individual. Okay, even though it's under your name, your farm, you might have the title of your land, and it says, look, your farm is yours. You are the owner of this property. Okay, this is your private property domain. In other words, it's true from a legal standpoint, but the way that farms are going to operate economically, okay, is that they're going to now come together and form a conglomerate, a complex in which the farms are going to be so-called, is called jointly owned, okay, joint owned farms, like a company, for example. That's what a company is. For example, companies are in many cases owned by several people. Okay, There are companies that are owned by a single individual, it's true, but there are companies that are owned by several owners, several investors. People put capital and they bring investment, they bring monies, they create an association, a company. And what they do is that they share risks, they share costs, they share profits, in other words. So this is what we're seeing here. Okay, what's called an economic cooperative. Joint owned farms, the Grange is actually bringing this model. In other words, that look, we're all going to help each other in a way that, look, we're going to work as a unit. In other words, as a group, and that our farms are going to be not that other people are going to own your property, but that the product that at harvest time, that is to say, that they're going to actually have granaries like warehouses in which they're going to actually control their own grain. We're going to help those that fail in 1 year. Everybody has a responsibility, in other words, to assist those that fail, because when you fail, let's say in a year, for some reason, your crop was destroyed, etc., those that succeed are going to help you stay afloat. That is to stay in business, because this is a joint venture. In other words, okay, it's a joint owned farm. That's what an economic cooperative actually means. Okay, in this case, okay, that's what a granary is actually a warehouse that actually stores all of the grain, again, that is now owned by all the members of the Grange, of this association. Everybody owns it. And they're going to create their own stores, okay? Because they want to control their own prices, in other words. So instead of selling it to the middleman, what they want to do is actually have their own stores, and they're going to withhold, if you will, the grain, in order to control the price of the grain, because they feel that the price of the grain is not really established by the farmer. Okay, it's actually something that the middleman controls, and the middleman always sells. It actually buys very, very low. In other words, at low prices. So they want to increase the value of their own product by creating their own stores as well. Okay, so again, this is a model that is from the perspective of farmers, is trying to actually enable them to actually have more control of the product. Okay, so in 1878, we're going to see that there's going to be a larger, organization that is going to integrate several local chapters of the Grange, that are propping up all over Texas, and they're going to now come together under an association that was called the Texas Cooperative Association of 1878. Okay, so what this is, again, is that there are now those very local associations are now networking, so they can be integrated into a larger association, okay, Texas Cooperative Association of 1878, in which they are already controlling their own product, their own grain, and they're actually opening about 150 stores, the Grange stores they were called. Those are stores that are owned by farmers. They're controlling their own price, they're selling the grain, and they're actually controlling, again, they're actually establishing the price of their own product. They want to be in control of the value, in other words, of the products that they produce and sell as well. And even the store as well, they're trying to control as well that aspect of work, getting the middleman out, in other words, out of the equation. Okay, so there can be larger profits, but as well that there will be larger profits because they're getting the middleman out of the way. They're helping each other, and there's a cooperative, that is to say, they have to cooperate. They have to assist the members of this organization, because everybody's going to actually help each other stay afloat, that is to say. Okay, so by 1877, we're going to see that there's going to be yet a much larger organization, that this organization is going to network with other local chapters of the Grange that are propping up across the United States. Okay, so by 1877, we're now all of the farmers in Texas that were already pretty much organized into these local organizations are going to now fall under the umbrella of what is called the Texas Farmers Alliance. Okay, the Farmers Alliance of 1877, which, by the way, this Texas Farmers Alliance was part of this larger national Farmers Alliance. Farmers across the United States are now coming together. There's a national representation, that is to say. And at the state level in Texas, it was called the Texas Farmers Alliance. At the national level, it's called the National Farmers Alliance. So again, farmers are now networking and they now have national leadership. Okay, in the United States. Okay, there's now this agrarian movement on the rise. Okay, so this national Texas Farmers Alliance, of course, was formed particularly because of the inability or unwillingness, I should say, from the traditional political parties, whether it was in Texas or at the national level, to actually provide relief to the farmers that were in crises. We just mentioned the droughts of 1885 to from 1885, I'm sorry, to 1886. Okay, in those 2 years, from 1885 to 1886, what happened in Texas as well as in other states is that there was a series of droughts, of course. It affected productivity. Many farmers were almost, at the verge of bankruptcy. And as Congress, actually, in Washington, D.C., was introducing a bill to provide relief, for farmers, the president of the United States back then, Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, actually vetoed that bill, So again, this was very, very shocking for the farmers nationwide, but also in Texas, that the institutions were not responding. That even when they were responding, like Congress, it was actually a president that was actually vetoing, again, a bill that was actually allocating monies for the farmers to stay afloat, to stay in business, that is to say. Okay, so this Farmers Alliance, therefore, saw that the only way that they could actually solve their own problems was not necessarily through appealing to the institutions like Congress or the president, even though those were important institutions to appeal, but they needed to create their own organization to provide political representation for the farmers in order to pretty much either push for reform or enter the world of politics altogether. In other words, we have to go, to move into politics ourselves, because we're not going to wait until, the politicians, the political parties respond to us, in other words. So again, this is leading now to the creation of this political organization by actually a scholar by the name of S.O. Dawes. Again, he's the one that is now building a political organization that is going to be the Texas Farmers Alliance. Again, the Texas Farmers Alliance is going to be that particular political organization that moving gradually into politics again to challenge the Democratic Party, because even though it is the dominant party in Texas, it's not responding again to the needs of the farmers, and they want to not only challenge the Democratic Party politically, but also they want to bring about certain reforms that are going to attend some of the problems of the farmers. For example, they want the government to regulate, of course, railroads, regulation of railroads. What that means is prices. In other words, they want the government to step in and actually force, if necessary, the railroads to reduce the rates, the prices for farmers transporting their product to the city. In other words, lower rates. What they want is lower rates. So they want government regulation of railroads. They want the creation actually of an agency that is going to be precisely enforcing that regulation of railroads, which is the Interstate Commerce Commission. So they want an agency, in this case, an Interstate Commerce Commission, that is going to be providing oversight to the railroad. So there's not going to be any abuses or overcharging farmers, etc., committing fraud, etc. Exactly, again, pretty much trying to regulate the railroad industry on behalf of the farmers, by the way. They also want to increase the money supply by introducing silver dollars, okay? Because there's only gold dollars back then, the gold standard. So what they said, well, if we lack, money, because there's only so much money that can be printed, well, why don't we just, create an additional pool of dollars into the economy by actually base those dollars with silver and inflate the currency. We want a bimetal currency, they said, bimetal. So there can be gold, currency. Banks can still issue gold dollars, but we will actually like to create an additional form of dollar, the silver dollar, that will be actually issued by farmers' banks. In other words, the farmers will have their own banks in which they're going to print silver dollars for the purpose of loaning that money to farmers that want to modernize, want to acquire the machinery with low interest rates, etc. And so banks actually can be also owned and controlled by farmers as well, with the silver currency as well. Okay, so this is again with the Texas Farmers Alliance is really pushing for those kinds of reforms. They also want, of course, the National Farmers Alliance that once and for all, it emerges in 1889, is also pushing for what is called a sub-treasury plan as well. Sub-treasury plan, let me put it here, italicized here. So what is a sub-treasury plan? A sub-treasury plan is simply, again, the idea of creating national warehouses, all across the United States for the purpose of withholding all of the grain that is produced nationwide will be actually stored in those warehouses in order to withhold it to create scarcity in the market. In other words, once you create scarcity, then the price of the grain will go up. And once that price goes up, you can actually release the grain and sell it on the market at that elevated price. In other words, instead of just underselling your product, for people to buy it at low prices, and people are pretty much devaluing the value of grain and food, thereby actually degrading, if you will, the economic opportunities of farmers to succeed. So what they want is, again, what is called a sub-treasury plan. Okay, national warehouses all over the country withholding the grain on purpose, pretty much, in order to fix prices. In other words, control prices. That's what they want. This National Farmers Alliance is now pushing for this national strategy. Okay. So again, this is something that farmers are actually going through, and they're now becoming highly organized with the Grange, for example, the Texas Farmers Alliance, and there's a series of reforms that they're actually trying to push for as well. Now let's look into the industrial working class, okay, rather quickly, okay. The Texas industrial working class is also another group that also experience their own dislocation. Just like farmers experience their own problems, their difficulties succeeding in this new economy, for the reasons I outlined, workers also went through a similar process, okay, of difficulties, dislocation, etc. So just like we did with the farmers, now let's look at the working class, okay, the background. So industrial workers, again, in Texas, went through similar problems that other workers in the country were facing, okay, and similar experiences, okay, the industrial working class, okay, all across the United States face similar, again, obstacles, similar problems, difficulties, that because they share those experiences, This is going to lead to a labor movement, by the way. Industrial workers are going to become also highly organized and politicized. So let's look then at the the conditions of the industrial workers. Okay, so first and foremost, the typical working day, for example, for an industrial worker during this time, it was 12 to 14 hours a day. There was no standard. In other words, there were no laws, there were no regulation, if you will, of industry to say, well, the maximum working hour day will be 8 hours, for example. Every employer, every industry, every enterprise had different arrangements. Okay, for most workers, it was anywhere between 12 to 14 hours a day. Okay, so long working hours. There was also no minimum wage, laws in the country at this time. So every employer also had different rates as well. Okay, and it actually varied from company to company, even within the same city, let alone from state to state. Again, even from in the same city, different industries pay different rates of wages as well. And for the most part, there were low wages as well, lower rates that workers found extremely difficult to actually live off of. In other words, they just barely were surviving. In other words, it's survival wages, that is to say. Okay, no, because there was no regulation once again as to what was actually a minimum wage that would be a living wage, for example. Okay, number three, that because industries were new, because they were barely flourishing, all of the industries we just mentioned in the previous topic, like the oil industry, for example, the salt industry, the lumber industry, and so on. It's a number of different industries that propped up and flourished all across Texas. So because they were new, nobody really had an idea of how to actually build, those structures, how to actually provide for safety guidelines and regulations, etc., protective gear, for example. All of that, was to be introduced, by the way. It will be introduced over time. But initially, all of that, all of those industries was barely being developing. They were just barely being born, in other words. Okay. So therefore, the experience of most workers back in this time is that they were working inside of factories that were extremely hot temperatures, 90 plus degrees Fahrenheit, for example, unventilated, also buildings, unventilated areas. Of course, there were chemicals and fumes that were present as well. And of course, the exposure to those conditions led to heat strokes or sometimes dehydration, for example, accidents or health-related problems, etc., of various kinds. Of course, that's another issue that industrial workers were facing during this time. Okay, so another issue is, again, no insurance or compensation. Back during this time, there were no health benefits. In other words, you're hired. Well, the idea of today that when you're hired, of course, you're being provided with health care. That particular benefit was not yet present, okay, in society, in the economy of this time. Or when people suffer an accident, they were not compensated. In other words, compensation is when the employer pays for your medical expenses when there was an accident on the workplace, etc. You need treatment, surgery, etc. That the employer must actually compensate. All of that was not yet present as well. Okay. And number five is that during this time, there was still child labor was very much alive, something that is very ancestral, by the way. Child labor did not come with industry. Child labor is really, really old. There was part of this system of the past when the children were supposed to contribute to the family economy. But now that there's industrial jobs, there's factory jobs, children are also taking on jobs again in various industries as well. And of course, because they're more fragile, so to speak, they also were subject to those conditions inside of the factories or industries. In many cases, suffer injuries, etc. And people actually prefer to actually send their children to school. By the way, prison labor was also an issue, again, affecting workers, because in many cases, what prisons will do is actually rent out their prisoners to companies to do construction jobs or factory jobs of several kinds and collect rents again on that prison labor. And that, of course, was taking jobs away from a lot of people and driving wages down. Wages were depressed precisely because the use of prison labor. Okay, prisoners were actually rented to, for example, railroad companies or construction companies to do work, instead of those companies actually hiring people and paying them wages, of course. So that's another issue, again, that wages were stagnant, they were depressed because precisely of the prison labor system. And that enabled, of course, the prisons to rent out prisoners, for labor. So therefore, because there were a lot of obstacles for workers to actually experience, again, a higher standard of living, for example. Well, how can you experience a higher standard of living if you have low wages, for example, or having an enjoyable life, social life? If you're spending 12 to 14 hours at the workplace, well, you're not really enjoying your existence because you spend most time there. In other words, you go home, you're really tired. You just want to take a bath and go to work and go to sleep. And the next day is the same thing, by the way. So you don't have that social life, that social aspect that makes us human. In other words, building, nurturing social relationships and the like. Yes, in the accidents that they suffered, etc. Again, so this is extremely important because the industrial working class also felt that transitioning into this new modern economy was not really delivering, if you will, this earthly paradise that people actually expected. That what they believed was that industry or the economy needed reform, that it needed change, it needed improvement, so they could actually enjoy their existence and enjoy the fruits of their labor as well. Okay, so that gave rise to the so-called labor movement in Texas. Okay, labor movement. And the labor movement flourished first and foremost when we're going to see the rise of what is called trade unions. Okay, trade unions. In other words, workers that belong to the same occupation or trade are beginning to come together and form a union. This is the new version of what in Europe, back in the Middle Ages, were called guilds. Okay, the guilds. This is very ancient. Again, unions there's nothing new about unions. Okay, or syndicates. Again, those are actually coming from Europe. The so-called medieval guilds, artisans, merchants form their own guilds, and so on. So to help each other, pretty much. To come together once again, to form an association, form a group, so the members of the group can actually assist each other, help each other, succeed or stay in business, or help during times of crises, etc. It's very human to do that, by the way. People feel more secure when they're in a group, by the way. Okay, so the idea of the union is, that labor needed to be more organized, in other words, to come together in order to actually bargain, okay, with the employer. That's called collective bargain. So if you want to bargain, let's say higher pay, higher wages, or less working hours, let's just say that, it is easier and better and more effective that you bargain collectively, that is, as a group, that the entire group comes together and bargain with the employer, as opposed to just one individual going to the employer and trying to bargain. Of course, one person is not going to be listened, but if the entire, group, the entire workforce is organized and tries to bargain, now again, the employer has a higher chances of actually listening and bargaining, negotiating deals, if you will. Okay. So in Texas, the type of unions that we're going to see, we're actually starting with, in the very early stages of this labor movement, the unions were the skilled craft unions, for example, unions of carpenters, for example, sailors, printers, for example. Those were the very first unions we're going to see. Again, this is like the baby steps, again, for the rise of the labor unions. But much later, when they're becoming more highly organized, with now the Industrial Revolution in full gear in Texas after the 1870s, and beyond. Now that we're going to see large industries, for example, now the workers in those industries are going to form their unions, for example, in the lumber industry, in the sawmill industries as well. We're going to see unions flourishing in the lumber or sawmill unions, in the piney woods, they were called. Again, now they're more highly organized. They're not just the skilled craft unions, but they're now part of those industries, the new industries. People are coming together and trying to bargain, once again, for higher wages, better pay, better working conditions, and the like. And we see that the beginning stages of that. The railroads are also going to, see the rise of unions, as workers in the within the railroad industry. The train operators, the engineers, etc. All of the people that work there are also going to come together and form their own unions as well, to bargain with the railroad company for increasing wages, etc. And the like. Okay, so in 1869, what we're going to see in Texas is the association, of unions actually from different industries coming together. They're networking, despite the fact that unions are pretty much separated by trade, by occupation, and by industry. They're now going to come together under the leadership of a larger association called the Knights of Labor. Okay, by 1869, the unions in Texas are pretty much coming together, and they're now, again, pretty much providing representation to different kinds of associations from different kinds of industries. Okay, workers are now represented by the Knights of Labor. In other words, by 1885, these Knights of Labor had already enrolled about 111,000 members, again, into this grand association. So it's growing. They're not just small scale type of units, if you will, that appear and they're propping up in certain companies or industries, but then now they're networking, they're coming together, and now they're pretty much growing in representation, okay, with the rise of the Knights of Labor. In 1889, we're going to see in Texas the creation, again, of another union that is also going to bring together all of the other unions, again, from the different industries and the like, across Texas, under now the leadership of what is called the Texas State Labor Union of 1889. Okay, and so what they actually center, this is one of the central issues of the Texas State Labor Union, founded in 1889, is the 8-hour working day. The 8-hour working day was the centerpiece initially. Again, they just wanted to bring the working day down to 8 hours. Then they said, let's just focus on that. Let's start from that point, and later on we're going to focus on other issues again. But it's important to bring it to 8 hours. Okay. So yeah, the labor movement in Texas was not really flourishing at the same rate that, let's say, the agrarian movement, was, because there was significant anti-labor campaigns, in Texas. For example, the lumber industries, what they did is that they networked with other labor industries, several kinds, and they form an association to pretty much suppress. It's called the Southern Pine Association, to suppress, again, labor organizers, for example, or somebody organizing labor, the leaders of the unions, for example, were blacklisted, and pretty much they were driven out of those industries and the like. So again, it was very difficult to organize in Texas because industries were also responding, to this growing movement of labor, if you will. Okay, so it was very difficult, in Texas. Now we're going to see that the farmers and the workers are going to come together and actually join forces to create a third political party. They believe it will be easier to simply going now into politics by joining forces. Farmers and workers coming together and form a third party, that is to say. And this is going to come to the rise of the populist party, or the People's Party, that is to say. Farmers and workers, again, now create a third party. Why? Okay, so what are the reasons? What are the factors, again, that is going to move those two different groups, by the way, to come together and join forces? Well, the disenchantment, once again, with the two-party system. Farmers and workers feel that their conditions, even though are known, and they even write letters, they send petitions to the political parties, whether it's at the national level or state level, that the political parties don't include in their platforms, in their campaigns, any of the issues leading with farmers and workers, that is to say, okay? So they're disenchanted with the two-party system. In Texas, it is the Democratic Party that is the dominant one. It's really a one-party system in Texas, is the Democrat. And even the Texas Democrats are also falling out of grace as well. The peoples of Texas, particularly the farmers and the workers, don't feel that the Democratic Party represents the interests, the needs of those two groups. So they're becoming quite disillusioned, particularly when President Cleveland, a Democrat, vetoed a bill that actually Congress had already passed to send money, to send, again, aid to the farmers across the nation, particularly in Texas. So as money was about to arrive, in Cleveland, Democrat, vetoed that bill. So again, this was, a shocker, to say the least, for those groups that this party is not really going to represent us. Look at what Cleveland did, in other words. Also, because the Democrats in Texas rejected the subsecretary plan that we mentioned, the idea of building national warehouses to withhold grain in order to control prices. This is something that farmers really were pushing for. They believed this was essential to control their own prices, but the Democrats pretty much were in opposition to this plan. And so that was also another issue that is going to move away a lot of people away from the Democratic Party. And of course, the case of John H. Hogg, again, this is a very important politician in Texas, a Democrat who, in the early stages, represented the will, represented the interests, the views of the oppressed, the people, the common individual, if you will, a true Democrat. He was a progressive, but over time, as he's becoming more and more dominant in the state, he transitioned from being a senator to attorney general in the state to being a governor. And he's acquiring more and more influence. He was actually now favoring more and more big business. So he's becoming now the representation of this big business Democrat that started out, by the way, in the early years as a progressive, very much concerned with the needs of the people and the farmers. But as he's increasing in influence and importance and acquiring a higher and higher post and become a governor by the 1890s, he's now pretty much favoring, again, big business again. So that was a great shocker as well, that, Democrats were now moving towards more and more to the side of the big business. Even though he was, the author of the Interstate Commerce Act, trying to create this commission to regulate railroads. He was really trying to go against the railroads, for the railroads not to seize public lands, protect public lands from ranchers or wealthy families seizing public lands, for example. He was on the side initially on the side of the people and trying to regulate railroad rates as well. In the end, when this commission was created, the Railroad Commission, instead of really allowing farmers to have any say to elect members of the farmers inside of the commission to control the rates, he appointed, again, the commissioners, the railroad commissioners, an appointment, in other words. So once he appointed his own people there, they were not going to change those rates. In other words, there will be no change in the railroad rates as well. And so this individual, again, will become like the symbol, again, of the Democratic Party in Texas that was now moving away from the farmers, from the common individual, and favoring things like railroads, for example, or big business. And that's the perception, again, of farmers and workers. Now, of course, the left wing, there was a left wing within the Democratic Party, really was seeking true reform. In other words, like they really wanted real drastic radical change to take place in the states. Okay, they really want to bring about reform, and so they're going to really kind of step out of the Democratic Party to create a third party. Okay, and this is done precisely by the assistance of the Knights of Labor and the Farmers Alliance, the Texas Farmers Alliance, which was also a national alliance with the Knights of Labor. They're going to join forces once again. The unions, okay, industrial workers and farmers coming together to form a third party. And they do that actually in Nebraska, in Omaha, Nebraska in 1892. They create what they call the People's Party, okay, the Party of the People in 1892. They call it, we're going to name ourselves the People's Party because we are really just ordinary people, okay? We're not really special interest groups. We're not part of the dominant, prestigious individuals of society, the entrepreneurs, the industrialists, big business, etc. No, we're just ordinary people that we constitute the bulk of America, or in this case, the bulk of the state of Texas. Okay, the people, they call it the People's Party. And their philosophy, if you ask, okay, so what was their philosophy, the People's Party? Their philosophy is not necessarily like, for example, the Democratic Party. The philosophy is democracy, the ideals of democracy, for example. Well, in the People's Party, the philosophy, the underlying philosophy of this party is called populism. Okay, this is really the ideology or the philosophy of the party. It's called populism. That's what they represent. So what exactly is populism? What they want is direct democracy, direct representation, the direct participation of the common citizen, what they call the common man in the world of politics, that the voice of the farmer and the worker, the individual in the street must be heard, and not just heard, but those individuals must also be elected into political office. That not just people with prestigious backgrounds and higher education, the educated, the intellectual class. That not only they were the ones to be the leaders, the representatives of the system, but also the farmer and the worker as well. Okay, this was a rural movement. Okay, populism. It means that this is a movement of farmers, and workers coming together, meaning that what they want is to really promote this idea of class consciousness, again, in the United States. In other words, so people can identify themselves as members of a class and not so much as members of, let's say, a race, a racial group, etc. That ideas of race are important, but that what identifies, what brings people together, people of all backgrounds, again, is the idea of class, that you are a member of a class that is underrepresented and perhaps even exploited. So therefore, that's what populism is, again, is the idea that we need to identify ourselves as class, in other words, a movement from below, from people, from the very bottom, again, of society, from the grassroots, coming together in order to promote this, again, class consciousness movement. That's what populism is. A popular uprising is a popular movement coming from below, in other words, that sees themselves as member of the bottom class, the lower class, that is to say. Okay. And so their idea in populism is what they want is to actually use the federal government to curb monopolies and big business. In other words, what they want is appeal to the federal government for protection, for assistance. They want the federal government to really limit the ability of monopolies and big businesses and to actually control the economy, for example, control wages, control prices, and the like. They want the federal government to step in and actually do that on behalf of the people below, that is to say. Okay. And the People's Party platform, again, was centered precisely on the ideas we already mentioned. Silver currency. This is what the party represents, not only within Texas, but nationwide. Silver currency, a bimetal dollar, gold and silver, a sub-treasury plan, once again, warehouses across the nation to withhold grain, to control prices, the abolition of a national banking system as well. Okay, that's what they also endeavor to do. Government ownership of railroads and telegraphs, not just regulation of railroads. They want ownership of railroads as well. Confiscation of railroad land grants as well. They want all of the lands that were given to the railroads to be seized, and so they can be given to the farmers, sold at lower prices to the farmers to create more farms. They want a graduated income tax. They want to create an income tax based on those that actually earn more will be paying higher taxes than those that earn less will pay less taxes as well. They also want the 8-hour working day and shorter work week as well. Okay, a shorter work week. Okay, so 8-hour working day and shorter work week. Okay, now, of course, they also seek political reforms. Okay, they want a secret ballot. They want voting to be totally secret. They want that kind of political reform. They want the senators to be elected directly by the people and not by the states, because the states are still electing, the senators. They want senators to also compete for votes in their own states, and the people actually elect them directly. And they also seek also the political reforms of actually allowing people to write bills. It's called initiative. People can actually send a bill, a proposition to Congress, for the people to participate directly, once again, in the process of lawmaking, or a referendum. That is, they want people to be taken into account also to decide on the fate of bills. So whenever senators, congressmen cannot agree on a bill, they can actually open up a referendum. That is an election for people to vote yes or no on a bill. That's what a referendum is. Okay, so I think we arrived now to our time limit here. We're going to actually make a stop. So when we come back, again, we're going to actually proceed to look at the populists actually gaining some seats in Texas. We're going to see what happened to the Populist Party, their accomplishments, their shortcomings, etc. And then we're going to be moving now into the progressive era when we come back again in session 2. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session 2 to look at the progressive era. Thank you.